Welcome back. And so now let's talk about some basics of RStudio. First of all, how does it work? And so you might remember that RStudio runs commands or scripts that are written in R. And the commands are usually written in the RScript window, which is at the upper left-hand side of your windows. However, you can also run a script in the console window, which is below that upper left-hand side, so lower left-hand side of RStudio. And then once you write the script, you can tell RStudio to run it. And then RStudio will respond with the result or an answer in the console window. Now let me go over additional information before we jump over to RStudio. First of all, when you program in R, you want to remember that the language is case sensitive. And so when you write your script, you want to pay attention to what's capitalized and what's not. You'd also want to know that different commands are separated by either a semicolon or a line break. And so it's a good rule of thumb to remember that RStudio will treat each line of code separately. Now let's say that in your script you wanted to write down some notes or comments, but you do not want that to be something that RStudio acts upon. Then you can start that line or note that you're just writing down a note or comment using the pound character. Not a hashtag. That's way too cool for my generation. And if you needed help and wanted to figure out what to do, a good way to ask for help would be to use one of these two different forms of calling for help. Help, and then in parentheses write down the function that you're trying to get help for, or use the question mark and then write the function after that. I'll show you how to do it once we hop on over to RStudio. Now, something else that's important to know about RStudio is that information is typically stored as an object. And you will be able to name that object in R and then designate what goes inside it using this form. And so you can name the object and then use a less than, hyphen, so there's no space in between these two characters, just an arrow essentially. And then to the right of it, tell R what to store inside that object. And so there may be an argument inside there that tells R what data or information or function to store in there. But this is a very flexible form of storing a lot of complex information into what they call objects. Now you can technically use an equal sign to do the same thing. And you will see me use the arrow typically because that's how I was trained and I'm just kind of more comfortable with it. But if you want it to be slightly more efficient, reduce yourself, one keystroke worth of typing, then you can also use an equal sign. It does the same thing. Alright, so welcome to RStudio. Welcome back. Now you might notice in looking at this, I just opened up RStudio. You might notice that I only have 3 windows and I'm missing my script window. And so I'd want to go to File and then New File and get a new script window. Ta-da! Here it is. Now, so this RScript window, as you know, is where we will be coding in R. And it really works like a glorified text window. Where you can just start typing things up. And this, you can graffiti however you want, and RStudio will wait for you. It's not going to act upon it until you hit run. And so you can do all sorts of things in here that is in R. Obviously, this is not R code. Another thing you want to know is that what you code in R, here in the RScript window, is the main information that RStudio is going to try to save. And so your code in R here is the main file that RStudio will use to refer back to your particular session. And the expectation is that when you want to come back to the same task or line of work or project that you want to work on, you rerun the script. That is typically the expectation, that you actually execute the code again to get back to where you want to be, to pick up where you left off in RStudio. There are ways to save your workspace with all the environment and work that you've done so far in RStudio, but at the end of the day, the idea is that you have code written down that you can run again to pick up where you left off next time. I'm just hitting a bunch of enters to create new lines. So here are line numbers. These are here for your reference to help you kind of figure out where you are in the code, but it is not part of the code. And then you can just start typing things away. Now let's start building some good habits. And so one of the very first things you want to do when you start working in RStudio is to tell it where to go in order to save and pull files. And so I might recommend that the first thing you do actually is to go to Tools and go to Global Options. And then make sure that RStudio knows kind of the default that it should always return to. And this is especially important for those of you who tend to get cloud backups, for example, OneDrive, as the default save option on your machines. You want to try to have RStudio always point to your hard drive. And so make sure to do that by setting a default working directory. You can see that I've set it here to my reference notebook inside RStudio. You want to generally point your default working directory to your hard drive. So I'd recommend choosing one place on your machine that you'd like RStudio to go to, if you don't tell it specifically where else to go. So that's the default working directory. And so I've clicked on OK. And the default working directory typically will show here as well for easy reference. And so the default working directory is something that you want to set once, and then you can certainly update as needed. But also every time you come into RStudio to run a new session, you might also want to set a working directory. So this is very commonly done. And so I would say every time you start a session, check to see where the actual working directory is. So working directory is a place that is associated with that particular RStudio session you're running. So in this case, I'm doing some basics. And so I might set my current working directory, so this is temporary and associated with your session, to basics on data management. That's a good place to go. Makes sense, right? And so I would open it and then look. There's nothing here in the script because I didn't write it down, but here in console, RStudio told me that it ran this command. So set WD means set working directory. So the working directory where RStudio will work in when it's currently in this particular session. Whoops. Something to know about our code in the console is that if you hit the up arrow, it will recall the codes that you ran. Anyway, something that I might do then is to just copy and paste the set working directory command into this particular R script window. Now, why did I do that? Well, it is a really good idea to tell RStudio when you first start a session and run your code where to go. And so my recommendation to you is to make sure that when you save your script, that up top you tell RStudio which working directory to go to. That way RStudio would not be confused every time you come back to the code and then run it. All right, now this, you might guess, is not really an executable code. And so let's see if I try to run it. So I've just highlighted. You can also, there are a few different ways to run code. One of them is to just highlight what you want to run and then run. And you notice that it returned an error. And so you will get intimately familiar, most likely, with seeing error messages like this in R. And the reason why is that RStudio is very sensitive. R is very sensitive to capitalization, as you know, punctuation, and so on. And so every time your code is not up to snuff, it will return an error saying, what are you trying to do? This is not going to work based on your R code. You might remember also that you can insert comments into your code by using the pound sign. And so now you might notice that RStudio recognizes that as a comment and it highlights it green. And so when you run the code again, no complaints. All right, so let's try creating our first object. Let's say I wanted my first object to be named, very aptly, my first object. Then I name it here, and then I've put an arrow next to it, pointing to that object. And so this is the less than sign, and then right after that is a hyphen to create an arrow. There's no space in between these two characters, so do note that these are just two characters, less than and hyphen. Alternatively, you could do an equal sign and it would be the same thing, so feel free to do that if you're more comfortable doing so. I'm used to seeing, whoops, not that, seeing my objects written in this format, so I'll be sticking largely to this. Now let's say that your first object was going to be a list of a few different things. In order to create a list, you would use the function concatenate, which starts with a C and then an open parenthesis. And then RStudio helpfully recognizes that you just started a parenthesis, so why not help you close it? And so it suggested a close parenthesis next to my cursor, which is nice. So let's say that this is going to be a list of 3 things: my favorite color, my favorite beverage, and whether or not I'm a mountain or an ocean person. If we could be divided into those 2. Let's say my first part of the list is my favorite color, so it's baby blue, right? Baby blue, which means that I have not had enough of my favorite beverage today, which is coffee, I think, aside from water. And then I would say I'm more of a mountain person than an ocean person, given a choice. And so now I have created this concatenate function with 3 elements. And so what I'm trying to tell RStudio to do, whether it works or not, we will find out, is to create a list of these 3 elements: baby blue, coffee, and mountain. Now, why are they in quotation marks? They're in quotation marks, these 3 elements, because these are text or string information. And so I will show you a different example next time about when we want to make a list of numbers. But in this case, this is obviously not numeric information. This is string or text. And so I have to put it in quotation marks to help RStudio recognize that this is a string or text information. So baby blue, my favorite beverage arguably is coffee, and then I'm a mountain person. So let's create a list of these 3. And that list is going to be called my first object. All right, so let's try running the code. Now I could do this and then try to hit run. I could also just put the cursor on the same line and then hit run, Control and Enter. And so let's see what happens when I do that. Ta-da! And so you see nothing except for the code that I just ran. But there's no error, which makes me rather happy. Here in the environment, it created a list, and so now we know that there is a thing called my first object, or an object called my first object, with these 3 elements. There's 1 row and 3 columns associated with it, essentially. This is what it's trying to tell you: baby blue, coffee, and mountain. Now, there is something called printing in RStudio where you can just kind of ask RStudio to show me what's inside an object by typing out the name of the object and then running that code. And so let me hit Control Enter to run it. And you can see that it returns a list that I just asked it to make: baby blue, coffee, and mountain. Hooray! And so now there's a thing called my first object. What should my second object be called? Lack of imagination is an amazing thing. And so let's say, and usually, object names you want to keep reasonably simple because you want to perhaps refer to it later. So this, I would say, is an example of fairly long names, but forgive me for using these as examples. And let's say it's just a list of numbers. Okay, and so now what I'm trying to tell it to do is to make a list with these 5 numbers. And you notice that I did not put those numbers in quotation marks because I consider them to be just numeric information. And so I can run the code, and it ran the code, and then, whoops, that is going to return an error, isn't it? And then I could ask it to just print the contents of my object by running this code. So I'm gonna, on this PC, I'm gonna hit Control and Enter to run that code. And again, it shows me what is inside my object. Now, just for reference, let's say that I want to create an object, and I found it really cumbersome that I have to type out the name of the object again. Here's a little trick you can do. So let's say that I'm making this list of 2 elements. Something nice here that you can do actually to automatically ask RStudio to print that object is to just enclose your command in parentheses right here when you're creating an object, and then you can just run that command, and it did both making the list and then printing it for you. And so if you want to save a little bit of typing, or you feel like this is an easier way to create and print information about an object, then feel free to include the line within parentheses like this. Now, one of the things that I already talked about is to do the help. And so let's say that you don't know what that C function does. You can do help and then just put the function in here and then run that command, in which case, poof, there is help. It just pulls up the information for that particular function. here in the help window, and so you can read all about it and see examples. Or alternatively, you could do the same thing by putting the command right next to a question mark, and then it does the same thing. So when you're stuck, this is a good option. So let me send you back to lecture slides and then Canvas to do some review questions, and then you'll be asked to also show me your first two objects. Alright, so now you're acquainted with RStudio, which is very exciting. Excellent job today. Now, as with any new platform or skills you may be learning, there will probably be questions or times when you get stuck. Please make sure to post any questions you may have on Canvas or flag me down. I'll be happy to lend a hand. Take care, good spending time with you, and look forward to talking with you soon. Enjoy playing around in RStudio.